think one of the reasons why people are into true crime is that most people find it very hard to put themselves in the place of a killer, a murderer. We tend to want to understand things that escape ready explanation. For example, I think I've always thought that this is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with the NXIVM cult, the cult where Keith Raniere had a harem of Hollywood women at his beck and call and millionaire heiresses funding him to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars when he looks like a creepy cult guy out of central casting to me. I don't understand that NXIVM cult one bit, how anyone ever believed anything that guy said. So consequently, I've been fascinated with the NXIVM case since I first heard about it. Same deal goes for the JonBenét Ramsey case. I think on a couple of different levels, actually. At the time in the mid-90s when it first happened, I think a lot of people were fascinated because they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that the Ramsey family could be guilty of murdering their daughter. I mean, they seemed like the perfect, rich, upper-class executive family living in a nice mansion. Father's a CEO. Mother's a very put-together looking housekeeper, former Miss West Virginia. A lot of respectability going on there. I think at the time law enforcement were a lot more apt to have those sort of biases get the better of them. I think today people realize that those sort of surface level appearances can be very deceiving. So now as the case has remained officially unsolved for going on 3 decades, when I look at the case, one of the things that has always baffled me is the ransom note. It's such a ridiculous thing. I mean, it's unlike any other ransom note ever written, and with very few parallels. I mean, the only one that really stands out, and I've done a video about on this channel, is the ransom notes in the Lindbergh case. And that's always been one of the central questions of the Ramsey case, is who would be crazy enough to leave that sort of ransom note if they were staging an inside job kidnapping. In other words, if the Ramseys really did kill JonBenét, who in their right mind would think that ransom note, that long, rambling, endless, strange ransom note, was a good idea? A ransom note full of theatricality and quotes cribbed from stage and screen. What a strange beast that thing is. And also all of the weird breadcrumb trails that seem to be implicit in it. The $118,000 that makes 0 sense as a sum of money to ask for. All of the internal contradictions in the note, like the small foreign faction who refers to themselves as foreign or small or a faction. And why would this foreign faction care if you're well rested or possess an adequate size attaché? Well, spelling attaché correctly, including the accent, but flubbing the extra S in possess. So it's with this backdrop in mind that I ran across an incredible Reddit thread recently that has a bunch of extra insights into the mind behind the ransom note. There's so many things in this thread that made so many things about this case and the ransom note specifically fall into place and make sense after so many years of cudgeling my brains about what could this possibly mean. This thread ended up explaining a lot of it. And the thread's title is called Profoundly Patsy, and it explores the influence that a short coming-of-age novel called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie had on a young woman named Patsy Paugh in West Virginia, who later grew up to become Patsy Ramsey, the mother. The Reddit user that created this thread, Cotton Star, by the way, I want to say at the outset here, has a YouTube channel as well that you should check out. He's got a couple of really interesting videos on there about the Ramsey case, including a good one about the other friends of the Ramseys, like the Steins, and how close they lived to the Ramseys at the time of the death of JonBenét. The writer of this thread, Cotton Star, managed to mine a bunch of really captivating nuggets from checking out the book and movie versions of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which we'll get into more about the author and the different versions of it. But there's so many things that were pointed out in this thread and that we'll look at in going through the different material that end up having connections to things that are in the ransom note or things just about Patsy's life in general. There's just a handful of different concepts and words that come up that have resonance to the ransom note. Like the word attaché comes up. We have the extra S in possession being a misspelled word. And we have pineapples with cream involved in the plot of the book. So how does this book relate to Patsy? Well, if you don't know anything about Patsy Ramsey, née Paugh, she's from West Virginia, and one of the main claims to fame that she has is that she won Miss West Virginia and participated in the Miss America pageant. What a lot of people don't know is that her talent in those pageants was reciting a scene from a play, and that scene, at least in the earlier competitions, was a scene directly from The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, the climactic confrontation between the protagonist Jean Brodie and the evil head mistress, which is a very intense and dramatic scene. And this was a very different approach for a Miss America contestant at the time. I mean, I think a lot of the talent would, just be singing like a popular song or doing something maybe like a dance number, but this, reciting a scene from a play as both characters doing multiple voices was, I think, a very unusual and a different choice. So I think in that sense, Patsy really did stand out. The other thing about the plot of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is that the plot of the movie especially revolves around a fake doctored letter, and there's just so many different things in the book and the movie versions of it that can be seen to have a sort of outsized or different presence when you know what happened in the JonBenét case, and especially echoes in the ransom note show up over and over again. So we'll go over those here in this video. And the other great resource that's mentioned in the Profoundly Patsy thread is a book by a friend of Patsy Ramsey's named Linda McLean. It's called JonBenet's Mother, The Tragedy and the Truth. And this book has a lot of anecdotes from friends of Patsy's and people that knew her growing up. And there's a few nuggets in here about her relationship with the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie and just little things about who Patsy was, so that we'll get to know her better and we'll get a fuller picture of her. One thing I want to say about doing this research and sort of taking a different tack here to really start to get to know Patsy and maybe even try to see her as maybe one of her friends see her, is that I definitely have like a much fuller appreciation of Patsy Ramsey, whereas before I think she was a little bit more one-dimensional in my head. I kind of just thought her as like more of like a cartoon villain because she is pretty comically evil in a sense. But on the other hand, I think, once you sort of understand a little bit more about her situation and where she came from and who she was, in a certain sense, some of what she went through can start to make its own infernal logical sense, and you start to understand her as a mother who is very protective of her children from a certain light. Now, not that I agree with it, but I mean, it's just, you come to understand Patsy as a multi-layered person, and as a woman who, that's one other thing that really gets emphasized when you hear all the little stories about what was going on at the time and sort of the background and all the different people in her life, is that there were a couple other things that are also interrelated with the story in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie that were affecting Patsy and that were part of the milieu of the case that don't often get talked about. And those are that Patsy had just turned 40 right before the murder of JonBenét, and she had also just gone through cancer. So those are two other parallels that end up having some resonance with the books as well as real life, and may have affected the case. So there's a lot of little interesting little nuggets like that we'll touch on. Yeah, so, and we'll also have links to all of this stuff that I reference in the description, as I always try to do in my videos. And I hate asking for anybody to subscribe because I hate asking anything from viewers. I know it's kind of like a douchey YouTube thing, but if you do want to subscribe for more videos, that would be great. I am really making a huge effort to try to make lots of new interesting content, and so I would appreciate it if you would give me a sub and like the video and leave a comment if you have some input. And I'm always looking for other suggestions for videos as well. So, alright, so let's get into it. Okay, so just to establish the general backdrop here, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie was originally a 1961 novel by Muriel Spark, and Muriel Spark is a really interesting subject all her own. We'll touch on her a little bit more later in the video. She was a really interesting author who wrote a lot of really intense fiction, and she actually kind of reminds me of Patsy a little bit. There's some interesting echoes of that theatrical, quick-witted character. And the novel was made into a film in 1969, and both the novel and the film are really great. I would recommend both of them. The novel's very short, and you can get it on archive.org. You can borrow it for free. It's only, I think, 139 pages, so it goes real quick. I just read it in a few hours, and the writing is very unique, and it's very intense. And essentially, the novel is like a coming-of-age story of a group of young Scottish girls in an all-girls school, and there'd be a group of the girls that's known as the Brody set is being taught by Miss Jean Brodie, who's a very over-the-top, unique instructor who brings like her own new ideas into the fold as a sort of like a upstart young Turk type agitator. And so the general tension is Miss Jean Brodie is always trying to get shut down by the powers that be, the evil head mistress who wants all of the girls not to have any fun and to be very boring and staid, whereas Miss Jean Brodie wants to enliven them and put old heads on young shoulders and make women out of these young girls.
Little girls, I am in the business of putting old heads on young shoulders, and all my pupils are the creme de la creme.
In the movie version that was came out in 1969, Jean Brodie is played by Maggie Smith, who gives an incredible performance. And you may know Maggie Smith if you've watched Downton Abbey. She plays an older gal in that show, but in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, she's a much younger woman, and it was such a treat seeing her play such a role requiring such huge range. So yeah, it was a really fun movie to watch, and the setting is really interesting. It's in the 30s in Scotland, so the interwar period. So a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So just some notes here as we look through the Profoundly Patsy Reddit thread. We can see here Cottonstar has like a nice long write-up where he gets into, sets the stage kind of like we've done here, talking about, how this was a favorite play of Patsy's, Patsy and Pageantry, bread and butter. I thought that was a really great way of describing who Patsy was. She was, in my mind's eye, she seems like she was just like a very theatrical woman, and I sort of kind of grew up with girls like that were sort of like theater kids, but very socially adept. So she described how the pageants she performed, she prided herself in doing something different, and that it was her bread and butter, is what she called it, of her performances. He also describes how the references that we have of her friends and Patsy talking about her relationship with this play. Patsy had read and memorized and crafted a performance from this, so she knew this material very, very well. And it was a huge influence on her, described as her greatest influence growing up. And he, in this opening post here, he quotes from Linda McLean's book, which we'll also get a little bit more into, JonBenet's Mother, how Patsy won the Miss Virginia pageant held in June 1977. She had just finished her last final exam of the semester and had to hurry home just in time for the event. For her talent presentation, she used a scene from the play called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. This was the same scene she had performed to win national honors on our high school forensics team. In oral interpretation, a student takes a scene from a story or play and interprets it for the audience. There are no costumes, props, or theatrical makeup, and the speaker talks in a different voice for each character. Cottonstar really went above and beyond here by finding quotes from old newspaper articles from the 70s. This is incredible. He quotes from a Charleston Daily Mail article from 1977 where Patsy Paugh, later became Ramsey, said, "My talent is a dramatic interpretation that I wrote based on a portion of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I play two characters, Miss Mackay, the stern head mistress, and Jean Brodie, the eccentric, vivacious school teacher. When I won second place in the National Forensic Tournament in Philadelphia, the interpretation was 10 minutes long. For the talent competition, it had to be cut to 2 minutes and 50 seconds. It's very difficult to establish character and build to a dramatic climax in less than 3 minutes. I can just picture Patsy saying this shit. It is important to establish how influential the prime of Miss Jean Brodie was to Patsy. Definitely. Then Cottonstar gets into bringing up a bunch of the examples, like creme de la creme, which is a French term. And one of the themes in all of this is that the general idea, I think, that gets expressed in a lot of who Patsy is that European mainland stuff is sophisticated, hence JonBenét and the accent marks, and American stuff is a little bit more backwater. And that's a theme that you definitely see played out in the book. And then Cottonstar then also goes into how Patsy brought up the prime of Miss Jean Brodie even in her police interviews. And she kind of goes over that story again here where he'd takes something from the transcript, and we see Patsy talking to Detective Trujillo about how she had done the prime of Miss Jean Brodie for her Miss West Virginia and won with that, and then went to do Miss America, and she goes through the whole. Patsy has a whole spiel that she talks about with why she couldn't get the rights to do the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Apparently, she attempted through, I think, like an elected official, like maybe like the lieutenant governor or somebody like that. She'd known somebody who was an elected official that tried to help her petition the screenwriters to let her use it for Miss America, because I guess it was might have been televised, but she couldn't get the rights, so she had to adapt her own scene. So she has this whole story that she tells a couple different times in a couple different places, about the rights and royalties, and so anyway, she tells the detective this whole story. So it's a big enough deal that she's, that when you end up talking about the prime of Miss Jean Brodie to a detective in a murder case, because it was that big of a deal for you in the Miss America contest or whatever. I mean, that says a lot, that it kind of keeps showing up over and over again. Anytime we want to sort of delve into who Patsy was, it's sitting there as one of the thumbnails. And so there, and then here, helpfully, Cotton Star also lists a bunch of quotes from the book and the play, where words that are familiar from the Ransman note or the case come up, including this passage where Monica, one of the girls, swings an attaché case full of books at the other girls. And then we have a passage in the book describing that the specialty of the feast was the pineapple cubes with cream, and that both girls saved the cream to the last and ate it in spoonfuls, which is basically exactly what the final meal of JonBenét was. And they found, pineapple with cream in a bowl in the house that night. So it's definitely a very significant detail. And at one point in the book, a character asks aloud whether or not she says she can't remember how to spell possession with one S or two. Well, it just so happens that possession is like one of two words that's misspelled in the note, and people have long speculated that those misspellings were put there on purpose to, again, try to lead the reader to a conclusion. And so then at this point, Constar in the thread describes how this is, this linguistic techniques have also been used to be able to find other people, like the Unabomber was found out his identity was discovered as being Ted Kaczynski through a similar line of unique linguistics, the have your cake and eat it too expression that his brother recognized. And then the other thing that he mentions that's a really great point that I wouldn't have thought of even after having read and seen the movie is that there's a plot device where there's a fake letter that's found in a book that the evil headmistress uses to try to frame Miss Jean Brodie. And there's this discussion in the book about, it was two different hands that were, fabricated this note, which just has a lot of really eerie allusions to the note in the JonBenét murder case, because one of the main leading speculations is that the note was actually a collaboration where Patsy was the one actually writing it, where John may have been contributing ideas, sort of dictating his thoughts. So yeah, I definitely would recommend checking out this thread. It's a great thread. There's a link in the comments if you want to check it out, because there's a lot of other really interesting conversation in the thread, and some of it I've incorporated in stuff that I looked into in terms of follow-up. So just want to add a few more points about things that I saw in the film and the book, and just also just want to follow up a little bit about Muriel Spark, a really amazing, interesting writer. The woman who wrote, the author of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. So just give you a little bit more of a sense of who Muriel Spark is, the writer of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I found a really great New Yorker article that profiles her and talks about a biography of her that was written, and sort of goes over her whole career. She had a fascinating career. She was somebody that I also sort of identify with it in a weird way, because she was sort of a late bloomer as well in terms of her literary aspirations. She wasn't a published author, I think, until she was around 40. And she just seemed like Muriel Spark just seemed like a really interesting lady, the way she's described in articles. Seems like she was a real firecracker. She had her opinions, and her writing style is utterly unique. It's hard to describe it. It's like she writes in these little slice of life vignettes, and her prose is very spare, and she communicates so much with so little, so economical. Like that book The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is only 140 pages, but I mean, it is a whole story in there, and it's like just like a paragraph or two can tell you so much. I mean, she's really a writer that definitely will repay the reading. She's a very unique, interesting talent. So, but anyway, here's a couple quick quotes about Muriel Spark that I found in that New Yorker article that I thought had some interesting resonance with Patsy. Spark was never a creator of character, the author of this article writes. She was a trickster of circumstances, a writer whose narrative voice speaks from the past or present or future at her own whim and will. She never foreshadows action when she can simply foretell it, with as much cruelty or merriment as she pleases. And the writer of this article really was a really great writer as well. So it's always a great pleasure when you have a great writer writing about a great writer. So yeah, the profile, which I'll also include a link of because I think it's a great profile. It was a books review article by Thomas Mallon from 2010 called Transfigured, and it covers a new biography that had just come out about Muriel Spark. One more quote from the article. Could easily apply to both Patsy and Muriel Spark, but this is about Muriel Spark. Easily enraged, Spark always demanded inordinate levels of attention and discretion. She thirsted for respect and invited protection, but as her biographer amply demonstrates, the border between protection and oppression was always narrow. She repeatedly organized novels like The Public Image, 1968, around her heroine's resistance to attempted takeovers. She could rarely trust or keep friends. Other people needed to be as manipulable as her literary characters. One other quick note from the Reddit thread before I get into a couple observations from the book. The username 14th Century Hood mentioned that Steve Thomas's book has a reference to the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and I looked it up and confirmed that it does, but it just has one quick mention that he talked to Linda McLean about Patsy using the play for her talent portion of her Miss America stuff. So that's all. It's just a quick mention. So one of the interesting things about the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie as a book is that it has a lot of different sort of palace intrigue revolving around this girls' school, and there's just a lot of quotes about people being, there's like one girl who's sort of like the redheaded stepchild, and so she's described it at one point as being too stupid to cover up. A lot of that just sort of interesting talk about secrets and intrigue. And early on in the book, we get this description of Miss Jean Brodie describing her fiancé dying in World War II. And pretty early on, we're also, given the setting of this book is in the 30s. So basically, we get the impression that Miss Jean Brodie's, even though she just describes herself as being in her prime, it's sort of ironic saying in that she's probably getting up there in age in her 40s. And so that has a lot of resonance in terms of Patsy having just turned 30 after surviving cancer and, being a beauty queen who is starting to lose her luster, her youth. And one thing that's really sort of arresting as I started reading the book is that it's like, wow, this book is a lot. Like, I had never read Muriel Spark stuff before, and I was like, it was sort of shocking because the book I watched the movie first, and the movie was, it's pretty spicy in its own way, but it was sort of more conventionally interesting, whereas Muriel Spark's writing does not play like the book in certain aspects is much darker and much more twisted than the movie, and in a good way, I would say. I mean, it surprised me how much it went there. So I don't want to spoil it, but the prose by Muriel Spark is very strong, very strong. And so one little side tangent I want to take here, because it mentions another book that I really love, is that one of the interesting things about the book and the movie is that the Miss Brodie character is a big fan of Mussolini, and like I said, sort of like a cosmopolitan, continental European lover. But it's interesting because it shows, I think, in some ways, like the flaws of Miss Jean Brodie's thinking. I mean, that might be one of the thematic purposes of having her be really in love with like the whole idea of fascism. But one thing that it immediately called to mind for me is a book that I read a couple years ago called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing by Alexandra Stein. It's a really fascinating book that I stumbled into as I was researching domestic violence, while I happened to be also really far down the rabbit hole about cults. And I was like, it just kept occurring to me that there's a lot of overlap between those two mindsets. And sort of on my own, I started looking to see if anybody else had written about this. And it turns out that, yes, in fact, there's a really interesting woman named Alexandra Stein who wrote a book about her idea called attachment theory, which says that there's a sort of an overlap in the frame of mind or some of the characteristics of the relationships between high control groups, aka cults, and then domestic violence relationships, and then totalitarian regimes. All of them have a sort of similar or maladaptive type of attachment disorder that they're displaying. Anyway, I'll put a link to the description for her stuff because it's really wild, interesting, and I do think that there is some fertile ground there for further inquiry, because I have just noticed a few things that I just have noticed a lot of overlap between some of those phenomenon: terror, love, and brainwashing. Interesting stuff. And the other thing that sort of dawned on me too as I was reading this is that in the book and the movie, Jean Brodie is a school teacher, so she teaches like a whole class of kids, but she has like a handful of girls that she favors particularly. And in the book and in the movie, they're called the Brody set. They're her special girls. It's a group of about, I think, 5 or 6 girls that she takes to extracurricular events and tries to transfer her love of culture and music and art. And this has a lot of characteristics of a high control group. You know, you have your in groups and out groups, and so it really sort of struck me on a meta level that that there's a lot of interesting parallels between the Brody set and a cult. And in fact, one interesting part of the book later on has like the young girls of the Brody set discussing how they had this peculiar teacher growing up named Miss Jean Brodie, as they're looking back in retrospect. And one of their husbands says, I always knew your upbringing was a bit peculiar. Yeah, it's just really funny the way that it's described in retrospect. And then I got pretty far into the book before I realized that one of the girls was reading a book called Kidnapped in the book. Like a book within a book was called Kidnapped, and so the girls were fantasizing about these weird kidnap scenarios. So this book, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. But that just kind of hit me on the face because it's like looking for parallels to murder kidnapping case JonBenét. It's like, wow, they're just all over the place in this book, right in front of you and somewhat more removed. But yeah, lots of interesting parallels. One point in the book, there's references to like American tourists and Miss Jean Brodie calling them vulgar. I thought this was just like an interesting, in light of Patsy loving accent on everything and probably being a little bit self-conscious about her own hickish West Virginia upbringing. I could just hear Hannibal Lecter's voice with all those rude, sticky fumblings with boys in the back seat. All right, yeah, that's the best I'm gonna do. There's also a subplot about 2 girls involving them working together. On the story of Jean Brodie's love life. That's the note that gets revealed in the climactic thing. There's just a lot of spy motifs and even different suggestions of people actually being involved in the spy service as it was in the interwar period. I also want to make too much of this because it's kind of like not exactly a one-to-one parallel, but there is a scene in this one where there's like a creeper that exposes himself to one of the young girls. There's a scene where the girls toss out notebook pages like the Ramseys probably did that night, because there are missing notebook pages in the famous notebook that the ransom note was written in. That still that was from the Ramsey house, that was written using implements from the Ramsey house. Nothing weird about that. Okay. Oh, and there's also a few references in the book to Jean Brodie, like having something growing inside of her, like assuming like a reference to some sort of internal cancer. Could have easily been ovarian cancer, just like Patsy. So I just thought that was really eerie that there is that parallel between both Miss Jean Brodie and Patsy dying young from some kind of cancer. Very sad. So again, I just thought that whole parallel with Patsy sort of having her 40th birthday right around that same time has always, like I said, been an under-considered part of this. I mean, that as somebody that just recently turned 40 not that long ago, it's like, yeah, that's a biggie. And as a schlubby dude, it's a lot different, I'm sure, than if I can't even imagine if at one point I had won some sort of pageant. I mean, Jesus Christ, I would never live it down, I'm sure. Turning 40 would be much worse if I actually cared about how I looked. Okay. Yeah. Just one other quick note is that, yeah, okay. Yeah, I have so many thoughts about the book that I almost don't even want to go in here, because it's just like I don't want this to end up becoming like a review of Muriel Spark's work in addition to how this relates to the Ramsey case, because almost got kind of swept away with how great of a writer she was. Almost just like, screw this Ramsey case. I want to talk more about Muriel Spark. She's a real fascinating lady, but I think that this is still such a interesting, underexplored thing. So the other thing I want to kind of go through real quick is that I also read JonBenet's Mother, The Tragedy and the Truth by Linda Edison McLean, which is a 1998 book written by Linda McLean, who's Patsy's good friend. And it has some info about the crime of Miss Jean Brodie, some references in there. But I also just thought it was worth going over because it helped me get more of a sort of granular understanding of who Patsy was. It started to sort of flesh her out a little bit more as like a real person to me. I understand her, I think, a little bit better. What makes her tick after reading this book, which is a book that Linda McLean describes having put out as a way of defending her friend, because she felt like the media coverage of the Ramseys was unfair. From a certain perspective, I can sort of understand that, but yeah, it is an interesting sort of slice of its time, the book, from the late 90s and from like a very small press. It was printed by a press called the McLean Printing Company, which is actually a West Virginia history and lore press. So a very small press, but the connection to West Virginia is, of course, that Patsy Paugh is from West Virginia and won the Miss West Virginia pageant in 1977. So that's the West Virginia history press connection. The book has a short foreword by Patsy, which is sort of like a very characteristically schmaltzy, sentimental thing about how much her friends mean to her. And I'm sure at some level she very much believes that. I mean, because, I think on some level Patsy was a warm person. The foreword also ends with a note that all author profits from the book will be donated to the JonBenét Ramsey Children's Foundation, which is another whole mini rabbit hole unto itself. The website A Candy Rose has an amazingly exhaustive page documenting, I guess you'd call them issues, with the foundation and the fundraising and the pledged money to that foundation and what happened or didn't happen with it. It's another book that's available on the incredibly helpful Internet Archive. I love the Internet Archive. I mean, there's so many great things on there. I always go and check there first before I buy another used book. I have so many books that if I can avoid buying one and just be able to borrow one from the Internet Archive, that is great. And this is another one that's available for free. Again, all the links in the description. So if you want to check out any of these books for free from the Internet Archive, I linked the actual versions that I reviewed. So in the introduction of this, it's sort of interesting from a almost like if you're doing like a sociological view of this case, because it presents kind of like the typical apologist view of like a Ramsey insider circa late 90s, where they sort of are unironically referred to as a good Christian family who wasn't capable of murdering their daughter. This is exactly like the same sort of thinking that made it so that Lou Smith and the whole intruder hypothesis is built on. Is basically like this abiding belief that good Christian people weren't capable of murdering their daughter. I think anybody who's familiar with statistics knows that's not how things work. I think the other thing that's become clear, I think, more and more to the average person in the intervening close to 30 years between now and the mid-90s when this first happened, is that we all contain multitudes. We're all capable of great anger and great kindness. I mean, I guess there's a continuum, of course. Some people are much closer to the concept of evil than others, but people are capable of murder regardless if they're Christian, Muslim, Jew, Pastafarian, Rastafarian. Yeah, doesn't matter. Linda explains her motivation for writing the book, that she had enough of the tabloid trash, and again, on one level, I sort of empathize with her and can understand having a family member attacked by the media or feeling like that there's some bias at play. They don't get you. And there is also sort of a ambulance chaser vibe to a lot of this case, because a lot of the same media that was involved in the whole Camp OJ coverage of the OJ case just moved on to the JonBenét case afterwards. So I think that there is a very good critique to be made of the media for their hyper focus on certain cases that played well to the television ratings. And that's also why I think that the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town is such a valuable resource, because it has like a lot of really interesting narrative tributaries where it has sources where people who worked for the tabloids and also for the mainstream press and also in the district attorney's office, and it just has like a very well-rounded perspective, interesting look at how cases were handled in the press at that time period. The 90s press is so bizarre. It's something I've spent a lot of time going over as I've tried to do stuff on the OJ case, but it's just so huge, such a crushingly huge subject that it's hard to really do justice to unless you do like a 10-part documentary like Made in America, like Ezra Edelman did a few years back. I think you could make a similar documentary about the JonBenét case. I don't know, I'm not saying that it would be, I think that they probably have a lot different things to say than the OJ case, but it's just an interesting subject that deserves a very deep and introspective treatment, I think, and not something so exploitative as like a Geraldo type treatment, or, like a made-for-TV movie or something like that, which was also something that ended up getting made. The Perfect Murder, Perfect Town book was adapted into a TV movie. So, as much as I can see like the warmth between the Ramseys and their friends, I can also see like the sleazy manipulations and the greasiness of the Ramseys enlisting friends like Linda McLean to launder their image, when I'm convinced that they are responsible in one way or another for the death of their own daughter. So I'm sure that they have their own justifications. But this is one of the reasons why I wanted to delve deeply into Linda McLean's book, to try to learn more about Patsy and why people defend her despite there being a lot of reasons to be suspect. So anyway, I think this whole exercise, if nothing else, gave me a greater a few extra layers into the mosaic of this case, just so I could get a better full resolution picture of what's going on. The other thing that was really interesting reading Linda's account is that Linda and Patsy connected because they had a shared sense of loss. Linda had a husband, Jim, who had just died of cancer, and of course Patsy had just recovered from cancer. So like the first and strongest impression that I got from Patsy from reading the book is that the first few chapters on her early years is that she was a leader and very outgoing. Seemed like a classic extrovert and somebody who seemed to fit very well with the societal expectations of her. She was a cheerleader and a beauty queen. And in the book, Patsy's cousin Debbie relates a lot of really interesting memories because they're contemporaries of each other. They were born within a couple months of each other, Patsy and Debbie. So they grew up and went to a lot of family events. And so Debbie and Patsy are both teenagers in the 70s. Having a lot of very similar experience having like a typical baby boomer upbringing in a somewhat more rural setting like West Virginia. And so, and Debbie describes how they both graduated from Parkersburg High School in 1975, and both of them also attended West Virginia University. They went into different sororities, and Patsy majored in journalism. So that's another thing that I think gives us like another granule of detail about who Patsy was. I mean, she's somebody that was very familiar with words. Words were in a lot of ways her stock and trade. I mean, she was a skilled writer, a skilled dramatist, a skilled actor. And Patsy's nickname to her early friends was Patsy Paugh. And Patsy is described over and over again by people that knew her as warm and friendly. Very common words used to describe her. Judy, her friend Judy from high school, describes them spending a lot of time at the roller rink. And then they were also both on the drill team in high school. And Judy was in the same, they both pledged Alpha Zeta Delta, I think is how it's referred to. It's, on the Wikipedia page it says they're referred to as AZD, the sorority or women's fraternity. And the motto I thought of AZD was very interesting. The pen is mightier than the sword. Certainly calls to mind the ransom note. And then Judy also has some interesting stuff in her sections where she talks about meeting up with Patsy at the 20th reunion in 1995. The 20th high school reunion after Patsy was recovering from ovarian cancer. And Judy just mentioned that her own mother had died young from cancer. And another thing that gets mentioned a lot in people's remembrances or in people's remarks about Patsy is that she wrote very beautiful letters. Even through her illness, Patsy was keeping up correspondence with folks. And Judy refers to Patsy as nice, sweet, and a little corny, which I just thought was notable because it was like the first note of a description that wasn't entirely positive or glowing. So even though it wasn't necessarily negative, it just stuck out to me as something that was noteworthy because I think it might have been might have been a little bit more reflective. And Patsy to me seems like the typical woman who likes to, put a lot of bric-a-brac, like live, laugh, love is the first thing I sort of thought of when I saw that description of Patsy as being a little bit corny. The other thing that's really interesting about this book is there's a lot of great photos in it I'd never seen. There are photos of like Patsy's mom and dad on their wedding day, and then Patsy as a young child, and you can just see her as like a typical American mid-century kid. Her dad, Don Paugh, was a military man. Her mom, Nedra, was a very beautiful bride. You can definitely see where Patsy got her looks from. And then on page 24, there's a photo of Patsy in braces, which is so weird because it's like, whenever I think of her as she was in 1996, and so it's really wild to see her in other contexts as a younger woman. Then on page 29, we have Linda describing the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, talking an anecdote about how Patsy had interpreted the scene of the play and added some. And Linda adds some context about how familiar Patsy was with the material, and how she also did the same scene for her high school forensics team. For her talent presentation, she used a scene from a play called The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. This was the same scene she had performed to win national honors on her high school forensics team. In oral interpretation, a student takes a scene from a story or play and interprets it for the audience. There are no costumes, props, or theatrical makeup, and the speaker talks in a different voice for each character. And then there's more backstory involving how Patsy tried to secure the rights, how there was like a whole ordeal trying to get permission to do the scene, and how Patsy eventually enlisted the help of the governor of West Virginia, J. Rockefeller, who ended up becoming a very prominent political figure. So that was very interesting. Linda then recounts how Patsy ended up doing a scene that she created that Linda described as between a columnist and a young school teacher that expressed Patsy's views on censorship. The scene was called Deadline, and Linda remarked on how Patsy was anti-censorship in the piece, and now Linda said that there was an irony and that the tabloids were using the freedom from censorship to pile on Patsy. And so Linda, the author of this book, has a unique relationship to Patsy in that she was Patsy's teacher, but she was only about 8 years older, so they became friends, and Linda spent a lot lot of time with Patsy preparing for the Miss America pageant in 1977. So they were very close for a while. And so Linda is definitely has a very unique insight into who Patsy was. Then we hear some stories from Patsy's sisters Paulette and Pam about what a great big sister Patsy was. And she does sound like she was a great big sister. And then we get some info in Chapter 5 on Patsy moving to Atlanta and how she met John. Her friend Claudia tells a story of how Patsy and her husband's younger sister were living with them short-term in Atlanta, and how Patsy was planning at the time to move back to West Virginia, but sort of by happenstance ended up meeting John Ramsey. And this was really interesting to me because I'd heard rumors before that maybe Patsy had met John while he was still married, but this whole story seems to pretty well refute that version of events. And at one point in the book, we get a bunch of testimonials from Patsy, from people Patsy knew when she was getting cancer treatment. And this part of the book is kind of a little bit saccharine sweet for me because there's a whole religious or redemption angle here, and a sort of just stories about like oncology nurses telling Patsy how much they do what they do because of people like her, just things like that are just a little over the top. And as an aside, as I was reading up about John's affair and trying to figure out the timeline of when he met Patsy, there's a really interesting anecdote. There's a really interesting page on the A Candy Rose site about a woman that John had an affair with that ended his first marriage, or that was at the end of his first marriage. The woman's name was apparently Gloria Williams, which may be a pseudonym, it's not clear. But the whole saga of John's romance with this Gloria Williams woman, who is his secretary, is very revealing if you sort of parse the details and think about them a little bit, and not just sort of accept the exact context that the stories that Patsy and John are telling, because they are different versions in a way, because John at one point describes Gloria as having sort of like a fatal attraction deal with him. But then I think John realizes that he's sort of overplayed his hand or outed himself potentially to the police by making such an overt movie reference that sort of lines up with a lot of the movie references in the note. And so he tries to walk it back and say, oh, I've never actually seen Fatal Attraction, but it's just what I've heard people refer to her as that. And that you can see that John resorts to like the passive voice where he doesn't want to give himself any agency. It's like he was helpless over this woman basically stalking him to use him for sex or something. I don't know. It's like John is just sort of really weird about accepting his own responsibility in this. But in one version of the story, John says that Patsy basically shooed this Gloria woman off in a version of this story where it's like almost like a screwball romance scene where this Gloria stalker woman, as John refers to her, comes to his apartment and Patsy's there, and she basically tells her to beat it. And then another version of the affair where when John first meets Lou Smith, he writes a letter to him shortly after the men get to know each other, where John reveals this affair as the great ethical lapse of his life. And so I think this was the gist that I took away from this, is that John wanted to make Lou Smith think he was this good Christian man, and he was putting all of his baggage on Front Street by sort of confessing this one peccadillo to him. Where I just think that Lou Smith, because he was such a deep Christian and he admitted to sort of meeting with the Ramseys and praying with them, I think I just think he had a obvious bias that he couldn't overcome in investigating the Ramseys. So yeah, there's references. There's a woman named Barbara who was at the NIH doing a special ovarian cancer protocol that was brand new at the time. And Barbara mentions that Patsy would buy several dozen copies of a book that if she liked a book to give to other patients if she found it helpful. And so it just was interesting to me because it made it seem like Patsy's the type of person who tried to use her wealth as a way to ingratiate herself with others. At times it sort of came off like the little kid whose parents try to buy him all the toys so they'll have friends, the backward sort of a way of reasoning how to arrange one's affairs. It just occurred to me as her cousin, Patsy's cousin Debbie has some more anecdotes where she describes Patsy's surprise 40th birthday, which is very interesting because I haven't heard a whole lot about it from reliable sources elsewhere, and it's such a big milestone for a former beauty queen that had just gone through cancer. Sure, all sorts of emotions were going on. And Debbie recounts how they had a surprise party in November, a month early, for because of the busy holidays that were coming up. And Debbie tells this really funny story, one of the funniest stories in the book, I think, where she says that there was a fellow who came dressed up like Miss America who did a comedy act on Patsy's life and accomplishments. So I wish there was tape of that, but I'm assuming it was a gay gentleman who was doing some sort of burlesque, which just sounds really random and funny. And yeah, I'm sure that was a scene to behold. The other thing that's interesting is Debbie talks about how JonBenét and Patsy were going to New York City for their trip soon after Patsy's birthday, and so they kind of had like a slumber party right before that, which was Debbie described as uplifting because Patsy had finally been cancer free. You also notice how everybody's sort of on message about how the kids were well behaved and nice, and Patsy is warm, and people have almost nothing but uniformly nice things to say. So it's in the couple instances where anything is something other than completely obsequiously complimentary, it definitely stood out to me. And so Debbie admits at one point that Burke and Johnny B, which was the family nickname for JonBenét, weren't perfect, and she mentions that Burke would sometimes get aggravated, which is the word she used, when JonBenét would get in front of the TV and pester him. So I thought that was very interesting that she was candid enough to mention that. And then Debbie also says something about how JonBenét wasn't spoiled, which I take it as code to mean that she was. But then she also sort of acknowledged that JonBenét sort of really was spoiled in the sense that she basically got to do whatever she wanted. And then, okay, so around page 103, we have the testimony of Susan Stein, which is, again, really interesting because Doug and Sue Stein are fascinating and under-discussed, in my view, part of this case. I had just been sort of talking with other people on the JonBenét Ramsey subreddit about how the Stein's participation in this case is odd when considered as a whole, because they were supposed to be like the last stop that the Ramseys made on the night of the murder. But I believe, I think that there's actually Cotton Star video that gets into all of this. That's definitely worth, I will link in the description, where they're supposed to be making one more stop before returning home. And then we get all the weirdness about how the story changed about whether or not the kids were awake, whether or not Burke and JonBenét were awake when the family returned home that before the murder, and then how there's a couple of changes in story about what exactly transpired after they got home, whether or not JonBenét went straight to bed, or if they did stories or open presents or what. There's a few different things going on, different versions. And then in a thread, somebody pointed out that the Steins weren't among the families that were called the next morning for moral support. So this was even more odd because the Steins lived very close by. So it just seems like a very huge incongruency, because the Ramseys called all sorts of people over to their house, but not their very close neighbors, the Steins, who were one of the last stops that they had seen the night before the murder. It's just very weird. I hadn't been aware of this. Anyway, and the other thing to even make it even more odd, to top it off, the Ramseys went to live at the Steins' house for about 6 months after this case. The families were super tight. The Steins had a son who was friends with Burke, and he's thought to perhaps be the only other potential participant in his subject, and the only other potential person that could have been at the house that night is the Stein kids, maybe around the same age. And it's just really odd because, yeah, people don't really talk about them as being, sort of close proximity witnesses in this case as much as I think they should. And it's just an interesting thing that I've been meaning to do more reading on, but I just haven't, because there's a billion other things always coming up. Weird world of creepy criminal cases I'm interested in. Man, I've been getting all sorts of interesting messages, and yeah, keep them coming if you get good ideas for videos. Susan Stein's comments on Patsy, in describing her as Patsy as like the perfect homeroom mother. We get that word "perfect" again. It comes up a lot when describing Patsy. It was just interesting because it sort of betrays that maybe something isn't perfect. And then Susan describes like an afternoon where other families from the kindergarten community were invited over to the Ramseys' house to decorate and make props for a Western-themed community spirit event. It just made me think like something that would never happen in 2024. Western-themed. I mean, I'm sure they were doing all sorts of very outre cowboys and Indians motifs. Anyway, Susan Stein in the book marvels how Patsy was so organized and got involved in making stuff herself, and she comes off to me as a little bit has a little bit of the Martha Stewart gene in her. Patsy does a little bit anal, organized, but I guess people say that she's organized, but then you actually look at pictures of her house and it's like a bomb went off in there. So I don't know. interesting incongruity there a little bit. Oh, and there, as I was kind of going through this, reading more about Linda McLean and her book, I happened to find threads on like the regular old JonBenét subreddit, the one that's for IDI people, and it's just interesting little tidbits when you get into that world that you don't see. So I think it's always kind of interesting to like read stuff from people that have like a way different perspective than you, because I was learning all about how somebody was like talking about how they got interested in the case. A commenter in the regular JonBenét subreddit, I don't know why I say regular, it's the IDI JonBenét subreddit is what it really is, said that they got interested in the case because Patsy's Charlevoix house had Laura Ashley style decoration. So this is just the sort of thing that I'm doing on my weekends and nights off, as I'm reading Reddit threads about how Patsy Ramsey liked the Laura Ashley style, and learning all about Laura Ashley and sort of a modern reimagining of Victorian patterns and the romance of the Laura Ashley style. Ugh, it's just endless. Anyway, so yeah, there's interesting threads in the IDI sub for the JonBenét book, The Mother, and JonBenét's Mother, The Tragedy and the Truth. Some interesting little nuggets in that thread in the JonBenét IDI sub. Susan Stein also uses the term "no one was a stranger" to Patsy and John. I thought that same language had been used earlier by Barbara from the NIH Cancer Protocol, who was a fellow patient with Patsy. She also used that same language, "no one was a stranger" to Patsy, which I thought was very interesting framing in a sense, because it shows, these people are, Patsy Ramsey is alleging that a stranger took her child. So it's just, I don't know, maybe this is on purpose to show how open and accommodating the Ramseys were, but it also seems to have like a weird potential double meaning there, or at least maybe a Freudian slip type meaning. I don't know. But yeah, Susan has a lot of very interesting comments in her section. I think it's pretty clear that she's very perceptive, Susan Stein, and her writing here is a lot more focused on Patsy and her personality traits rather than Patsy with other people, which is a lot of the other material in the book. I'd say most of the other material in the book is about Patsy and her interactions and relationships with other people. But the Susan Stein section, I think, is uniquely focused, and I think Susan's a sharper than the average bear in this book, in that she talks more about Patsy and how she found Patsy, that Patsy wasn't outwardly vain, especially after chemo. So that was an interesting observation from Susan. And then to close out Susan's section, she has an interesting little passage about how Susan said she was able to have a conversation with Patsy in depth about her cancer treatment. And Susan and Patsy talked about the many other women that had been in the NIH protocol study who had already died within a few years. So the NIH thing would have been in the fall of 93. And the murder was at the end of 96. So it had just been over 3 years by the time of the murder. And I tried to do like a little bit of digging. Again, can you believe that I spend my weekends on like the National Cancer Institute website looking for like a 1993 NIH study that Patsy Ramsey may or may not have been involved in? But I did find out that they had just approved a drug called paclitaxel as a chemo medication specifically for ovarian cancer right around that time period. It's one of the big milestones on their website, on the National Cancer Institute's website. Their almanac, January 92, that drug went live. So yeah, I think Patsy was one of the first people to get that cancer drug, and she had a very good outcome compared to, I'm sure, most of her cohort, because she lived quite a while when the survival rate's probably not that great for 5 years. And she did well better than 5 years. She made it to, I think, around 10 years after the murder or so. So anyway, yeah, I really feel sad in a lot of ways. It just goes to show you how devastating cancer can be. I think that was one of the main triggers in a lot of ways for this case. I mean, I don't, without really knowing exactly what happened, but I think that there's a lot of indications from like the way that the kids were, behaving in some pretty weird ways with, like the stuff like about the stories with like, fecal matter being in the clothes, and just some weird acting out that the kids are involved in. I think that, when mom is sick, sometimes it really changes the whole the family dynamic. And so I can imagine that there's a lot of pain caused by everything involved with Patsy's cancer. And yeah, it's just a lot of moving parts with this case. So It never ends. So yeah, around page 108, there's a woman named Linda Mason who it seems like she lived or was like maybe was like a babysitter or was like some kind of nanny or something like that. But Linda had some pretty interesting things to say that sort of raised my eyebrows about how when she first heard about the murder, she thought she had stayed near JonBenet's room when she stayed at the Boulder house, and she thought that she just recalled that Patsy was always the first one up in the morning, and that Patsy always used the spiral staircase to start the coffee. And so she just assumed that whoever did the murder had to know the layout of the house, and I agree. And it was a very telling detail in a pretty otherwise detail void book. It doesn't really get into any sort of spicy speculation about who did the murder. In this one section, Linda Mason does talk about her suspicion that it had to have been somebody that knew the layout. And when you see like what a ramshackle labyrinth that place was, I think she brings up a good point. But I think that the purpose of this, that Linda Mason speculation here might be trying to point to like an inside job, like maybe the housekeeper Linda Hoffman Pugh, which was a favorite suspect for Patsy and John to point at. Or maybe somebody from Access Graphics, like Jeff Merrick. And then Linda McLean has some more anecdotes about Patsy, and she has a quote from a really odd quote from Bill Cosby in here about how the Lord knows what it is to lose a son. I thought this is all sorts of irony about it because of what has happened with Bill Cosby in the intervening years, but Bill did lose his son Ennis in the 90s, so I'm sure this was something that was out there in like grief counseling groups at the time. But yeah, it's just interesting to see a name like Bill Cosby in a book like this when we're thinking about like the wide breadth of what human beings are capable of. I mean, there's a famous Dave Chappelle bit about it. So at the end of the book, Linda says her piece about like why she doesn't think they could have done it, and again, it's that she just doesn't think that it's possible for parents to have a nice Christmas with the kids and then sexually abuse them and bash them over the head. Which is, of course, there's a lot of black and white thinking here, and doesn't sort of take into account that a crime scene can be staged. And then I can understand why the friends and family of the Ramseys don't want to believe the worst. I mean, it would be very difficult to buy that, I think, if you knew them to be normally upstanding members of the community. But then Linda just talks about like why she doesn't think that the staging makes sense because the Ramseys could have like left a door open or done something to suggest an obvious entry. And this is an interesting point, but it does sort of speak to like a bigger issue in terms of what exactly was going on with this staging and whether or not both parents were perfectly in lockstep with every element of it. I mean, there is a theory that John didn't become fully aware of what was going on until some point that morning, and that Patsy did all the staging that night. So there's a lot of different like possibilities that could explain why some of the staging is really crazy. It doesn't make sense, or like why the body didn't leave the house if there's a ransom note. I mean, all that sort of stuff I think that you're seeing there is like the fog of war. Like these people didn't sleep the night before. They were probably crazed and trying to come up with any solution so that they wouldn't lose their other child. I mean, there's just a lot of, when you really put yourself in that situation, it starts to, some of this really illogical stuff starts to make more sense when you're like put it in the context of people going through a weird, crazy, traumatic situation on not a lot of sleep, trying to stage something to the best of their ability when they're very sheltered, rich people that don't really know how a ransom note works, or that's how you end up with this crazy ransom note that has all sorts of fingerprints of the actual author in it. And that's why we see, when we look in our deepest of microscopes, we see the DNA of the prime of Miss Jean Brodie and of who Patsy Ramsey / Paugh was. So that's what I think that the real value of this type of approach is, this holistic approach where we try to find out more about who Patsy was and what made her tick. And the more that I've done so, the more that I've tried to fill in the full mosaic, the more and more every puzzle piece fits. This woman being the person who wrote. Anyway, that was quite the journey. I'm so thankful that you came with me on the ride. There's so many things for future reading. Like I said, both the book and the movie, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, if you haven't done so already, check them out. I'm actually off to try to probably go read more of Muriel Spark's stuff, because her reading, her prose is so captivating. If nothing else, I am profoundly grateful that I discovered Muriel Spark from this exercise. Gosh, there's just so much meat on this bone. And I really want to thank Hot and Star for being gracious enough to be fine with me, with being cool with me using his material in a video. I know that he has made a number of videos on his YouTube channel, and he may make a video on this someday, and I really hope to watch it because I think he's got some startlingly unique and interesting ideas about this case. His YouTube stuff is great. I just wish he made more of it. That's my only complaint. I hope you found this interesting. Like I said, I am really getting into YouTube stuff. I'm having a lot of fun making videos. So if you've enjoyed the video, I hate to ask, but please subscribe. It would really help, and it would spread the videos out there so other people can see them. And I really want to keep making videos, man. I'm really enjoying it. So I would really appreciate your buy-in if you want to subscribe and like the video and interact with it. Share it. I'd really appreciate any of that. I really do. It's I'm having a lot of fun. So I hope you're having fun watching, and I would really love to hear any feedback you have. And thanks for stopping by.